Before the first light of daybreak came, that sound a deep, dry cracking. Even now, anyone who was listening on that January night in 1998 speaks of it as the most horrifying sound they've ever experienced. Despite the wind's fierce howling against the window panes, rattling the frames, this noise was something else. Entirely, it originated inside the homes themselves. The load-bearing timber was failing beneath a burden it was never meant to carry. Roofs across Pine Ridge, Montana, were giving way in the blackness, one by one, flattened by 50 tons of snow. The snowfall had built up over 3 unceasing days of storm. That night, 247 people were left without a roof above them. Gone were their walls, their beams, their furniture, along with the memories tucked away in boxes beneath beds. A few had just enough time to flee outside in their pajamas into the negative 30 degrees Celsius chill. The rest had no such opportunity. The following day, Flathead County was officially declared a disaster area. Headlines in Missoula called the Pine Ridge event the most severe structural disaster ever triggered by snow buildup. For the whole state of Montana, it ranked as the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. Yet, one detail was omitted from those headlines or brought up only briefly, almost as if it embarrassed them. A solitary cabin sat high on the crest of Screaming Ridge, the rock formation that overlooked the valley from the east. That morning, it looked exactly as it had on every morning before, whole and untouched, with no mark or fracture on its walls. Snow seemed to slip away from its surfaces, almost like the ice was afraid to linger. That cabin belonged to Adeline Lawson, the woman the town had labeled the crazy stone shield lady for 3 straight years. She was the one the valley's lead contractor had labeled paranoid in public. She was also the one summoned to the town council and pressured into tearing down what she'd constructed. On that particular morning, though, nobody mocked her or said a word about her. All they did was stare upward, silent, their feet buried in snow up to the knee. They studied the stone arch that topped the ridge, looking as though it had stood forever. It was as much a part of that peak as the granite underneath, and a few those willing to be brutally honest with themselves were already starting to recall. They remembered their own comments from the day they watched Adeline Lawson haul the first stone block up the road leading to her land. What they remembered made them uncomfortable. This is the tale of a woman who had already lost it all, the career she adored and the man she loved. She resolved that her house would not be taken from her as well. That structure, mocked by the town for 3 years, turned out to be the single decisive factor. Plenty of those very individuals remain alive today to recount what happened. Adeline Lawson hadn't moved to Pine Ridge in search of companionship. She'd come seeking precisely the opposite. 5 years before all this, she'd been among Chicago's most admired structural engineers. Her portfolio boasted not one failed project, and her name stood on one central principle. That virtue meant telling the truth that the calculations showed. Even when it unsettled the people writing the checks, it ended up costing her career. But ahead of her job, it had already taken something even more devastating. In October 1993, the Fulton Street warehouse came crashing down. Adeline had handed in 3 separate written warnings, advising that the mezzanine beams wouldn't handle the intended weights. The developer had designed a logistics operation around those very loads. Her 3 reports were shelved, and the building work proceeded anyway. For 4 months the structure held, but then the mezzanine gave way during a night shift with 16 workers inside. 3 never made it out. Among the dead was Daniel Lawson, an architect married to Adeline for 9 years. That day He had entered the building to examine the exact beams his wife had reported as dangerous. Adeline was never charged. The reports provided her legal cover, yet while the justice system cleared her, she condemned herself. That is a punishment that never runs out. In the spring of 1994, she left Chicago and drove for 2 days with no destination in mind. The car eventually rolled to a stop at the highway exit marked Pine Ridge, Montana. Something about that place seemed distant enough from everything. She ended up buying the cabin at the ridge's end for a price that mirrored its abandoned condition. The first year she spent being exactly what the town believed, a quiet recluse. She came down to town on Tuesdays for supplies and avoided speaking to anyone whenever she could. The town kept its distance with that courteous indifference they reserve for people who plainly want no company. This arrangement might have lasted forever, but the spring of 1995 came and Adeline Lawson started to build. What nobody in Pine Ridge realized was that during that silent year, Adeline wasn't just passing the time. She had been studying a century's worth of Flathead County weather records. She also went through structural load reports for high-altitude roofs and read air mass convergence studies from the National Weather Service that almost no one had ever opened. In those papers, she came across something that affected her the same way the Fulton Street beam reports had, the stark and unsettling knowledge that something universally accepted rested on a supposition the data didn't back up. Later events wouldn't unfold immediately, but they were destined to happen. The earliest sign in Pine Ridge that something odd was taking place at the outsider's property was the arrival of the beams, 8 massive steel I-beams of the type used in industrial bridge work. On a Tuesday in April 1995, a heavy-duty truck delivered the beams to the base of the ridge access road. The truck couldn't chance the dirt road, as it would likely sink into the spring mud. So Adeline Lawson brought in a helicopter pilot who usually worked in logging to lift each beam to her property. That morning, the turbine roar bouncing through the valley sent several neighbors out of their homes to see what was happening. The sight was unsettling enough. Mr. Patterson's hardware store quickly became, that day, the busiest rumor mill in the county. In that town, last week's biggest news was that Patterson's delivery truck had shown up 2 hours late. So 8 industrial beams being lowered by helicopter onto a residential cabin was huge news indeed. But the steel beams were merely the opening act. What followed turned into Pine Ridge's regular spectacle for the next 3 years. Every single morning, Adeline Lawson drove her Ford pickup down to the Whitefish riverbanks, about 6 kilometers from the valley. She would stand there for hours, knee-deep in the freezing water, extracting stones from the riverbed. These weren't little rocks. They were rounded boulders weighing between 18 and 27 kilograms each. Eons of current had worn them into smooth, naturally interlocking shapes. She loaded them into the truck, drove back to the ridge, unloaded each one by hand, and then began laying them in place. The townspeople observed the whole operation with a blend of fascination and genuine concern. What Adeline was constructing wasn't a fence or a retaining wall. It wasn't any structure that an experienced rural builder would have instantly recognized. It was an arch, but one so large and oddly shaped that it matched nothing ever built as a residence in Pine Ridge. The steel girders she'd had airlifted formed a kind of curved frame. It soared directly over the cabin's existing roof without so much as grazing it. A gap of nearly 1 meter was left between the roof timber and the metal arch's interior. Onto that framework, Adeline placed steel rod layers that had been welded into a tight grid. Using a blend of high-strength mortar and industrial epoxy, she attached river stones to the matrix. The adhesive had been ordered via catalog from a Minneapolis supplier. Her construction was a parabolic masonry arch reinforced with a steel core. Back then, no local resident could have identified it with technical accuracy. Its purpose was to redirect compression forces from the vault's midpoint, channeling them into the anchor pillars set deep into the ridge's bedrock. The arch's parabolic shape was not chosen for looks or by chance. It emerged from exact computations that took into account the prevailing westerly wind angle, the all-time peak snow accumulation rate at that altitude, and the friction coefficient of the smooth river stone surface. This was set against the coarse texture of standard pine and tile roofing. All the variables used in those calculations came from materials Adeline had specifically requested, ordered by mail, and studied for months before she placed the first stone. Not a single element of the structure arose from gut feeling or routine. Numbers were behind everything, the only authority she had ever relied on. Those same figures had showed her, albeit too late, that her judgment about the Fulton Street beams was correct. Adeline was aware of this, because she'd spent a full year working through the math. Her neighbors, however, had no idea, since nobody ever asked. The sole individual who attempted to start a discussion regarding the project was a schoolteacher by the name of Ruth Gallagher, residing 2 houses further along the ridge. Ruth was given an explanation so technical and dense that she concluded the newcomer was undoubtedly a genius. Yet that same outsider proved utterly unable to converse with everyday folks. Dempsey was the contractor behind nearly 70% of the valley's roofs, built or fixed over 3 decades. He didn't bother with a technical discussion. When sarcasm worked better, he wasn't the type to engage in technical talk. A large, burly guy with a booming voice, he commanded attention in every room. His career was built on the reinforced timber truss system brought in from a Portland supplier. He championed that system with the same devotion people typically give their favorite baseball teams. A single afternoon sufficed for him to see the stone arch rising above the outsider's cabin. He concluded it was the most ridiculous sight he'd ever encountered, and announced that opinion aloud at Patterson's hardware store. He had a large enough audience that the judgment hardened before anyone could scrutinize it. It soon became known as Lawson's Folly. The label endured the way nicknames do when they capture what many were already eager to believe. Not long after, Dempsey used Patterson's hardware store to deliver his most unforgettable comment about Adeline's project. That store was, after all, the only spot in town where you could be fairly certain of one thing. Any statement you made there would spread to every part of the valley before the day ended. The store itself was long and dimly lit, carrying the scent of motor oil and treated lumber. Behind the dark wooden counter, Patterson had spent 4 decades selling screws, paint, and unsolicited advice. On a Wednesday in September 1995, Tiago leaned against that very counter. By that point, Adeline's stone arch had grown tall enough to be seen from the valley road. Then Tiago voiced the line the entire town would echo for the next 2 years. What's going on? Is she putting a tomb on the cabin to avoid burial expenses? Laughter ricocheted off the hardware shelves. Patterson grinned from behind the counter. A couple of day laborers, waiting for their pine boards to be cut, glanced out the window toward the ridge. They nodded as if they might catch sight of the arch from that spot, wearing the look of people who had just gotten the verification they anticipated. That same afternoon, Adeline came into the store to pick up 3 bags of Portland cement and encountered a silence unlike the usual one. It was the sort of quiet that signals the prior conversation was not the one that would happen going forward. She paid without making eye contact and exited. As she headed back to her truck, Tiago caught up with her in the parking lot. His demeanor wasn't openly hostile. Instead, he carried a patronizing friendliness. Such friendliness is tough to dismiss, as it leaves you without a valid excuse to react angrily. He assured her he meant no offense, acknowledging that she came from the city and that practices there were different. Still, he had been constructing in that valley for 30 years. The pine roofs held up because the pine itself endured. The extra load she was placing on her cabin exceeded what the existing timber frame was designed to carry. In truth, she was creating the exact danger she intended to guard against. Adeline paused, looked at him, and then answered. With those roofs' standard slope, the structure cannot survive repeated saturation. Mr. Dempsey, the timber is going to give way. She delivered the words in a calm voice, just as she might comment that the afternoon clouds were threatening rain. Tiago already had his laugh lined up and broke into it before she finished speaking. That laugh reflected 30 years in the business and a pine that kept standing. It kept bouncing across the parking lot while Adeline hauled cement sacks into the truck bed. She headed back up the ridge without saying more. Neither Tiago nor anyone else in Pine Ridge knew what Adeline had sitting on her desk, because nobody had ever asked. They were Flathead County's weather records, spanning 112 years and documenting 3 events where air masses converged. Of those occurrences, only the one in 1912 had stayed in the valley's collective memory. That was solely because the destruction it caused was enough to be passed along over 2 generations. Adeline had ordered the weather service records from the State Archive in Helena. Those records showed that within 72 hours, Screaming Ridge received snow loads beyond what ordinary roofs could bear. 19 structures collapsed during that 1912 storm. Those who survived rebuilt the same kinds of buildings out of the same kinds of materials. That was the only construction method they knew, and human memory spares us the details that would trouble us more if we recalled them with clarity. Adeline had spent her silent year studying atmospheric circulation models. The models showed that the ingredients for a similar event were coming together. The predictability of the cycle suggested a span of 3 to 7 years following her purchase of the cabin. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a sufficiently high likelihood. A structural engineer with her experience would view doing nothing as reproducing the very mistake made on Fulton Street. So she continued building. Although Patterson's hardware store parking lot had become the site where her sanity was officially called into question, the arch kept growing. Progress was slow throughout 1995, regulated by the heaviness of the stone and the endurance of one person's hand tendons. That autumn, Wyatt Sullivan, who lived farther down the ridge, placed a garden table on his back porch. From there, he had an open view of Adeline's work. He made a habit of inviting people over to stare at what he had come to call the troll under the bridge. He'd point across to the stone arch peeking above the pines. His guests would laugh, and Wyatt would too, while the arch continued to rise. Rugalaga taught 5th grade at Pine Ridge's school. She may have been the only person around who tried to understand what Adeline was making before judging it as right or wrong. She visited one July afternoon, bringing a bottle of apple juice as an excuse. She remained for 2 hours watching the work and asking questions. She left with a sense that she'd shared a conversation she only partially grasped, yet one that was obviously meaningful in ways she couldn't yet express. The following day, she asked at the hardware store whether Patterson had any book about roof load engineering. Patterson looked at her as though she'd asked for a manual on astronautics and said he'd have to order it. Ruth said to order it. 3 weeks later, the book arrived from a distributor in Missoula. Ruth read it with the same careful attention she gave to a student's work when something didn't seem right. She didn't follow all of it, but she understood a good deal. The phrase, Lawson's madness, started to seem less accurate to her than the rest of the town believed. By spring 1996, after a year and a half of continuous effort, Adeline Lawson's parabolic arch had reached a sufficient height. It was on the verge of closing at its midpoint, roughly 4.5 meters above the cabin roofline as seen from the valley. On clear days, with the afternoon sunlight coming at an angle across the ridge, the structure acquired a certain presence. It was hard to overlook, even for people who wanted to. It possessed a kind of monumental strength that the wooden and slate roofs elsewhere in town didn't have. This was the same quality that tells apart a permanent concrete bridge from a temporary scaffold. It communicated a feeling of lastingness that requires no explanation, being tangible, visible, nearly audible in the material's density. But Pine Ridge had already settled on its reading of the project for so long that a purely aesthetic remark could alter nothing. The label was Lawson's Folly, and that label already possessed the weight of an accepted reality. People who meant no harm uttered it with a kind of ironic fondness. Some believed the odd building, in subtle and difficult to define ways, harmed the area's reputation, and they spoke the name with annoyance. Others, such as Tiago Dempsey, whose professional standing rested on that very belief, said it with near contempt. 3 decades of working in a particular valley with particular materials outweighed any theory brought in from outside. Adeline remained silent. From her time in Chicago, she had learned that debating with a person whose mind is already made up before listening merely squanders time and effort to no productive end. She had likewise come to understand that time and effort are the sole, genuinely non-renewable resources a person possesses. She put that time and effort into continuing to lay stones. When the arch was finally sealed, upward of 4,000 river stones had been spread across a welded wire surface. The welded wire surface created a mesh 15 centimeters thick that sat beneath the initial masonry layer. A further 1-2 centimeter mesh was inserted between the first and second layers. The anchoring arrangement was the most crucial part of the entire build, and the one Adeline had computed with the utmost care. A vault of that weight over an existing wooden cabin could work only if the anchoring was executed properly. Snow and wind would produce compressive loads on the vault surface. These loads needed to pass straight into the mountain's solid rock, not into the cabin's timber framework. The 8 WT steel girders she had flown in by helicopter did not sit atop the cabin's log walls. Instead, they rested on reinforced concrete footings that Adeline had bored 1.2 meters into the ridge's granite the prior summer. The core drill had been rented from Kalispell, and she had transported it to the site on her own. Every girder was welded to an anchor plate set within the concrete. Steel rods 22 millimeters in diameter, filled with pressure-injected epoxy resin, anchored the concrete to the granite. The log cabin could vanish underneath the arch without the arch shifting even a millimeter. From a structural standpoint, the arch was completely independent of the cabin. Ruth Gallagher, the teacher who had earlier tried to start their technical discussion, spent an October afternoon in 1996 beside the nearly completed arch. She stood there, gazing at it for a long while. Then she asked Adeline what the whole structure weighed. Adeline replied that it came to roughly 85 tons, counting the steel, stonework and mortar. Ruth took that in quietly for a few moments. Next, she inquired about the weight of snow in a worst-case accumulation scenario, namely on a standard roof of a cabin that size. Adeline put it at 40 to 50 tons, depending on how dense the snow was. A typical timber roof was built to bear 8 to 12 tons. Ruth stayed quiet for the rest of that moment. The following day, she purchased a number of books on alpine building techniques at Patterson's hardware shop. Patterson needed to special order them from a Missoula distributor, as he carried none in stock. In the autumn of that year, Guyard Sullivan and Tiago Dempsey jointly submitted an official petition to the Pine Ridge Town Council. Their request was that Adeline be compelled to tear down the building. The petition invoked zoning regulations concerning the visual continuity of the landscape and the use of industrial materials in residential districts. Within a week, it had collected 142 signatures, a sufficiently expressive majority for a town with fewer than 400 adults. Even had he wished to, Mayor Andrew Higgins could not disregard the petition. The town council session was set for the first Monday in November. By the time Adeline Lawson walked in carrying a cylinder of blueprints, the meeting hall was packed to the final seat. The harsh glow of the fluorescent lights lay across 2 rows of residents. For weeks, they had awaited this moment, carrying the anxious anticipation of people who have long since made up their minds and are merely waiting for the formal process to ratify their decision. Tiago Dempsey occupied a seat in the 3rd row, his arms folded across his chest. Sitting in the 2nd row, Wyatt Sullivan wore the look of someone who had set things in motion and was confident they would unfold accordingly. Adeline made her way to the front, avoiding eye contact with both of them. Pulling out the blueprint tube, she set the papers on the vacant table positioned before the podium. The packed hall held no terror for her. Chicago had hosted far messier iterations of this very scenario, with developers and attorneys packing rooms and jabbing at their documents. It seemed numbers could shift significance based on the person delivering them. Inside Pine Ridge City Hall's Assembly Hall, the air carried the scent of wet wool and the particular tension of spectators eager to hear official phrasing of what had been whispered in private for months. Along the walls, attendees stood, others perched on the floor beside the fully taken seats. The crowd's low hum simmered with the heat of disputes not yet voiced, yet the verdict felt predetermined. Mayor Higgins settled into his center chair, his expression betraying a wish to be somewhere else entirely. Still, he accepts his place here. 2 minutes before the session started, Adeline Lawson slipped in through the rear entrance, offering greetings to no one. She spotted a free chair in the 1st row and took it, laying the blueprint tube across her lap. Several in the room eyed her with the honest fascination of those encountering her in person for the first time. She appeared younger than most had imagined, her leanness speaking of steady physical labor, not poor care. Her calloused hands were plain to see, and she sat neither guarded nor confrontational, just straight-backed. Her posture signaled a deliberate choice not to send unspoken messages. It conveyed only an openness to hear and to reply. The mayor recited the session's intent in the tone of one forced to read text he'd rather skip. After outlining the request's conditions, he handed the floor over to Adeline. Adeline's task was to answer the accusations that was the unspoken framing of the situation. Beneath it lay an inadvertent condescension she recognized but chose not to address. Sometimes calling out the way one is treated proves less effective than showing that figures remain figures, no matter who presents them or where. Rising, Adeline pulled the blueprint from its tube and unrolled it across the empty table reserved for her before the podium. The dual-scale chart displayed, on one side, snow accumulation data for Screaming Ridge spanning 112 years. The opposing column listed structural load limits of the valley's various building methods. Across that century, the two curves crossed at three distinct points. At each of these intersections, county damage reports indicated roofs lost. She gestured to everyone, explaining their significance plainly, without flourish. The 1,912 convergence had breached the load threshold within 3 days, while the milder 1,947 event merely grazed it without going over. That year's county insurance records listed 31 roofs suffering major structural harm, yet no full failures. The 1,963 crossing, the third one, caused 4 auxiliary buildings to fall, while main homes stayed intact. All 3 incidents followed an identical atmospheric recipe. A Pacific moisture plume slammed into a frozen Arctic vortex parked over the Canadian Rockies. That collision generated a precipitation cycle that never starved for water, self-sustaining over a fixed region for 48 to 96 hours. Circulation patterns observed over the past 3 years hinted at a chance, not a guarantee. They indicated, however, a demonstrable likelihood that such an event would strike again within 1 to 4 years. The valley's buildings, erected following the conventional codes of the time and place, couldn't handle that weight. Her own building, in contrast, had been engineered precisely for that situation. If requested, she could back that claim with thorough technical evidence. No one requested it. Yet, Mayor Higgins briefly studied the chart before his gaze shifted to Tiago Dempsey. Crossing his arms, he sat in the third row, his look conveying that he had spent 3 decades constructing in that valley. No chart created by an outsider would alter that. According to Higgins, the town council recognized Miss Lawson's worries. However, the petition focused on zoning and visual appeal rather than structural integrity. The proper course involved filing a request to have the building permit reconsidered, accompanied by the relevant technical papers. He allowed her 30 days either to provide those papers or to initiate the demolition voluntarily. Adeline grabbed the plan, rolled it up, inserted it into the canister, and slipped out via the back door she'd come in through. That paperwork had been complete for half a year, and she'd readied it prior to any request from anyone. Indeed, that set her approach apart from the way many others operated. Those individuals had previously made expensive choices. She got the paperwork in order, having it ready before it was required, rather than afterward to account for a failure. 2 weeks afterward, the updated permit got the approval. The stone arch above Adeline Lowndes' cabin could be legally contested solely by demonstrating that the structural computations she'd submitted were wrong. Nobody in Pine possessed the qualifications, the leisure, or the genuine motivation to attempt it. The label Lawson's Folly continued to be mentioned, although somewhat less often. In Flathead County, autumn 1997 made its entrance with seasonal temperatures, averaging 2 degrees colder than usual. Accompanying it was a type of sky that forecasters term unstable, while local ranchers simply deem it a portent of misfortune. That October, Adeline completed the sealing of the arch's final portion, She put on the last coat of industrial polymer, giving the river stones a surface that was both water-resistant and shaped to minimize air resistance. For the final time, she descended the aluminum ladder and retreated a few steps to view the entire construction from outside. It matched her calculations precisely. A stone vault, parabolic in shape, which fully surrounded the cabin while leaving it completely untouched. On the west side, the structure slanted at a 4-5 degree angle down nearly to the ground, redirecting the dominant winds from that direction. Its east side terminated in a protruding shelf designed to shed snow before it could pile up. Seen from the valley floor below, it resembled a colossal turtle shell settled on the ridge. Viewed from above, had someone been watching it, would have been clearly recognized for what it truly was. A construction built for endurance. That arch represented 2.5 years of Adeline's labor. It also held the majority of her savings and Daniel's insurance payout. She'd repeatedly vowed never to tap into the insurance money. Ultimately, however, she spent it on industrial epoxy and the diamond-tipped bits for the core drilling equipment. Her hands bore permanent traces of handling stone and metal. She suffered from persistent pain in her lower back. The physician in Kalispell had warned her it wouldn't get better if she stayed with this line of labor. She tucked that worry away to think about another day. Still, the arch was complete. For 2.5 years, she had risen prior to sunrise and headed to the river. Thousands of times she had driven back and forth in the truck, its bed laden with rocks. Every afternoon she had been up on the scaffolding, using her bare fingers to apply mortar, since there were areas the gun simply couldn't get. The arch now stood complete, precisely as she'd envisioned. Later that day, Wyatt Sullivan passed the property in his pickup. Spotting Adeline on the driveway, gazing at the completed construction, he decelerated, came to a halt, and lowered the window to inspect the arch for a few moments. His comment was not unkind, merely that it was the oddest thing he'd ever encountered. He remarked that he hoped it would serve some purpose, then drove on. That was the nearest to praise Adeline had gotten from any local neighbor in 3 years, and she accepted it with the same face she'd worn upon hearing the insults. The 1997 winter brought the cold, though nothing out of the ordinary. Snowfall during that season was typical, and no significant problems emerged on the valley's roofs. Over those months, Tiago Dempsey put in 3 new roofs across the valley, using his strengthened wooden trusses. He earned good money for each of them, and whatever private opinions he held regarding the chat outside Patterson's hardware store, he kept to himself. Pine Ridge remained just as ever, a modest mountain community with a strong measure of self-regard. He held the belief that the combined knowledge of the town's longest-standing inhabitants provided sufficient insight to handle anything the mountains could throw at them. That winter, Adeline engaged in an activity she'd long abandoned, taking it easy. She read non-technical books. On sunny days when the cold was moderate, she took strolls along the ridge. The snow had packed down well enough that each step didn't plunge her up to her knee. She made 1 or 2 extra trips into the village than was typical, purchasing coffee at Donna Hartgriff's store. She was the sole resident who engaged her in conversation without a direct business exchange. Donna never inquired about the bow, Chicago, or the other reasons Adeline seemed like a puzzling outsider. Her only question was whether Adeline took her coffee with milk or black. That was precisely the level of interaction Adeline required at that stage of her life. Some individuals possess a natural talent for relating to others in exactly the manner those others prefer, without any prompting. She was just such a person, as uncommon and invaluable as steaming coffee on a January day. In a small community where any person knew far too much about any other, that was a rarity. However, the weekly meteorological data she reviewed from her desk gave little comfort. A high-pressure circulation over the North Pacific tends to precede the strongest convergence phenomena. It was strengthening with a tenacity she'd not witnessed since the records of 1911. The county archives referred to the year following 1911 as the Winter of Broken Roofs. Historical records showed a one-year gap between that same pattern and the convergence event. This implied that, should the cycle recur, the winter of 1998 would bear no resemblance to 1997. The bow was completed right on schedule, or so the data indicated. Well, the storm commenced on the afternoon of the 9th of January 1998, a Wednesday, resembling an ordinary snow event. Pine Ridge experienced this type of snowfall on numerous occasions every winter. Long-term locals responded with the combination of familiarity and caution that comes from years of coping with mountain conditions. Around 3 p.m., the sky sealed over the valley and medium-sized snowflakes started to come down. Wyatt Sullivan's porch thermometer registered that pattern as typical for the season. While collecting their kids from school, a number of parents remarked that a substantial snowfall appeared likely that night. They spoke nonchalantly, as one would about something anticipated, with no special worry attached. When darkness fell, the pattern had shifted not dramatically, and with no abrupt alteration that would have immediately caught everyone's attention. This shift was a slow evolution, making it more hazardous. By the moment one perceives that the situation has entered a new category, too much time has elapsed for the course to be easily changed. The snow transitioned from medium flakes to a thick, almost sideways barrage. This onslaught was propelled by a northwest wind that had not appeared in the day's earlier forecast. In just 2 hours, the temperature fell by 4 degrees Celsius. At 9 p.m., the county's road maintenance department shut down the Kalispell entrance to the interstate. Around 6 patrons still occupied Donna's bar, which typically shut its doors at 10. The bar phone rang with news of the road closure, but few took notice. Every winter, heavy snow forced the highway to close multiple times, and it invariably reopened within a few hours. This was simply another element in Pine Ridge's customary winter cycle, as typical as the need to wrap outdoor pipes in December. Equally ordinary was the habit of leaving boots on the porch to keep mud from being tracked inside. The very normalcy of that routine was the issue, since it obscured the point at which the apparent normal had ceased to be. Adeline remained awake, having sat at her desk since the afternoon. She possessed the barometric readings from the instrument she'd placed outside the cabin, along with the weather service information faxed from Elena's station. The data she examined corresponded, with an almost surreal accuracy, to the pattern she had tracked for months. Just as the simulations predicted, the moisture plume from the Pacific met the Arctic vortex that had stalled over Alberta. Over the northern Rockies, the system kept strengthening. Precipitation readings from the initial 6 hours already showed exceptional energy. This wasn't a simple snowfall, it was a convergence event. She took the pickup down into town at 10 p.m. Driving cautiously, she followed a road. The snowfall was quickly making indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. She went directly to Mayor Higgins's residence. She kept knocking until the bedroom light flicked on. Higgins arrived at the door in his robe, finding Adeline standing in the snow with a fax. Within 3 seconds, he understood she wasn't there for a social call. No talk of theories or old records came from her. Instead, she handed him the facts showing the expected accumulation for the coming 36 hours and told him that the preventive evacuation plan to the school shelter had to be put into action. That building was the valley's only one whose concrete construction was strong enough to maintain its integrity under that kind of weight. Higgins reviewed the figures twice, glanced at Adeline, and then phoned the volunteer fire chief before even closing the door. The following 2 hours became a test of on-the-fly emergency planning. Volunteer fire trucks traveled through every road in the valley. Street, Peter's church's alarm kept ringing non-stop to alert those living furthest from the center. Naturally, some people pushed back. Tiago Dempsey answered his front door. He wore the look one might have if told that the sun would come up in the west that day. He claimed he'd lived in the valley for 3 decades and those roofs had never failed. The young volunteer at his door, Carl Breen, had been hearing stories about those roofs his whole life. He wasn't sure how to reply to that. He just said the mayor had put the alert in place and the protocol advised going to the school. Tiago shut the door. Wyatt Sullivan needed another 20 minutes to make up his mind. Only when he stepped onto the porch to gauge conditions with his own eyes did he finally decide. The railing snow depth had climbed 15 centimeters in under an hour, something no normal snowstorm could account for. He went back in, roused his wife and 3 kids, and began stuffing blankets into bags. At midnight, 186 people were sheltering in Pine Ridge School. Still more kept coming, in pairs and small groups, moving through the falling snow. The streets had become nearly impossible to tell apart from open fields. The school gymnasium could hold 200 seated in its bleachers. In ordinary times, that space would have felt ample for any community gathering. But on the night of the 9th of January 1998, over 190 people in pajamas had packed inside. Children were bedded down in sleeping bags, scattered across the gym floor, making the room feel far smaller than usual. The contrast between indoors and out made that space feel vast. Wind pounded the windows with a steady rhythm that wouldn't let anyone forget what was going on outside. Now and then, a sound from some part of the valley rose above the wind, a deep, definitive snap that was wood giving way. Those who heard it described that noise as wood yielding to a force it couldn't withstand any longer. Over in the gymnasium, Adeline sat at the table where Mayor Higgins was coordinating with county emergency services. She'd arrived only after helping the final holdout from the ridge come down, an elderly man named Bartolomeo, who swore he'd weathered 40 winters in that home. He wouldn't pass a single one of those winters in a school gym. Adeline had persuaded him using the one argument that matters to someone who stuck with the same routine for 4 decades. She laid out the exact forecast figures for the night plainly, with no drama and no embellished warnings. It was just data placed on the table, exactly as she'd always presented it. Bartolomeo glanced at those figures, then went to get his coat. At about 1 a.m., Tiago Dempsey walked into the gym. He entered brushing snow from his shoulders, with the look of a man who'd reached a difficult decision. He spotted Adeline near the coordination table. He approached her without the easy laugh that normally started any discussion about the Ridge project. Settling into the chair opposite her, he asked, without any trace of irony, how much longer the storm would go on. He also asked her to give her best guess for the total accumulation. Based on data from the past 6 hours, Adeline said the system would remain active for another 30 to 40 hours. She added that Screaming Ridge was expected to get 3 to 3.5 meters of compacted snow. Tiago sat silently with that for a few seconds before asking if the trusses could handle that much. Adeline said they were designed for a max load of 250 kilograms per square meter. She went on to say that the predicted snowfall would create a load of 400 to 450 kilograms per square meter. Tiago slowly nodded once and had no more questions. That creak wasn't the night's last, it was just the first. At 2:40 a.m., a creak sounded from outside the gymnasium, like the onset of something still ongoing. Kids in sleeping bags on the parquet floor didn't wake. They have a knack for deep slumber in the middle of chaos. At some point in childhood, adults lose that ability and never completely regain it. But the grown-ups, still awake, exchanged looks. That wordless communication needs no speech, because everyone reads the same meaning. Something is happening. The gymnasium had a reinforced concrete roof, built to bear loads far beyond any residential roof in the valley. The storm, however, had no regard for categories. Tiago Dempsey was the first to notice, pressing his palm to the plasterboard ceiling. Dampness was starting to seep through one spot above. That meant the snow outside was already past the threshold that this kind of seal was rated for. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a caution. The next sound, at 3:20, was unlike the earlier one. This creak came from within, from the timber framework supporting the roof above the entrance hallway. That hallway wasn't in the building's original design. It was added later, built to the local standards of the time. For 30 years, Tiago Dempsey had applied those same standards across the entire valley. Now, that corridor was yielding. Adeline got up, walked to the corridor's entrance, and looked upward. In 2 seconds, she recognized what took the others 20 more seconds to realize. The roof's transverse beams were sagging under the load. Failure could be expected within 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on whether snowfall continued at the same rate. Should that corridor collapse, the rubble would cut off the gymnasium's only exit. "We must brace that roof from inside," Adeline said to Mayor Higgins. Her calm was exactly the same as when she'd relayed all the night's other updates. "We have what it takes to do it, and the school storage room will supply the rest." Higgins glanced at her for a moment, then turned to the janitor, who nodded and rushed off in the direction of the storage room. What unfolded in that gymnasium over the next 40 minutes was the clearest possible proof of what Adeline Lawson's lifelong knowledge was meant for. That sort of knowledge wins no admiration at a city council meeting. Yet, it's the one thing that stands between order and ruin when ruin is already on a timetable. The school storage room contained whatever it did have. Steel plates left over from the latest kitchen renovation, plus steel pipe meant for a plumbing job that never happened. Additionally, there were hydraulic bottle jacks from maintenance equipment. The channel steel rails composed the detachable base of the foldable bleachers propped against the gym's back wall. It wasn't a construction warehouse's stock. It was a modest school storage closet. But it was all they had, and all they had sufficed for anyone who knew precisely what to do. Adeline needed less than a minute to take in what she saw and reach her decision. The kitchen steel plates would brace the hallway roof. More plates would go on the floor beneath the jack support points, spreading the compressive load over the greatest possible area of the parquet. The steel pipe sections would become vertical columns, joined by threaded couplings. She'd noticed those couplings in the first box the janitor had opened. At the base of every column, the hydraulic jacks were positioned between the steel plate on the floor and the column's own base. They made it possible to apply pressure gradually, shifting the corridor's wooden beams onto the new steel supports in a carefully controlled way. If the parquet gave way beneath the concentrated load, which was probable unless the procedure was done correctly, the bleacher rails would have to be laid crosswise below the steel plates, thereby tripling the surface area for load distribution. In 90 seconds, she laid everything out for Mayor Higgins, while the janitor and 2 volunteers carried the boxes out of the storage room. Higgins listened to the whole explanation, nodded, and then asked what he and the others were supposed to do. Adeline said she needed 4 people who would follow instructions exactly and avoid taking any independent action. There was almost no margin for error in lifting the load asymmetrically on a structure that was already compromised. In that situation, individual initiative was a danger rather than an advantage. Higgins indicated Tiago Dempsey, police officer Carl Holden, and Wyatt Sullivan. The first jack was set in place by Tiago Dempsey with outstanding accuracy. Although he had never carried out that sort of task before, his 30 years of work with structures meant he grasped the principle immediately when Adeline explained it. When the parquet started to give way beneath the 3rd column, Wyatt Sullivan reacted fastest. Adeline said the rails from the stands were needed at once, and Carl Holden was the first to swing an axe at the bleachers locking bolts. He did not require a second instruction. Following Adeline's directions, the 4 jacks were pumped in unison. Adeline, located at the 4th jack, kept the others synchronized with loud counts. Even load redistribution was essential. Raising one end of the damaged beam ahead of the other would have produced lateral shear forces. Those forces might have set off the very collapse the operation was intended to prevent. Adeline knew this, because she had seen what occurs when a compromised beam has its load removed unevenly. What occurs is not a gradual improvement of the situation. Instead, the failure accelerates in the direction carrying the least load. The wood of the corridor beams produced a sound as the load beginning transferring to the steel columns. For Adeline, that was the most significant sound she had heard since arriving in Pine Ridge. It was a deep, continuous groan, not the onset of a collapse, but the exact opposite. The beam conveyed a release of pressure that had already been very near its limit. The shower of plaster, dust from the ceiling dwindled and then halted. The occasional creaking of the wood ended, leaving the 4 steel columns straight and firm. The weight that the winter of 1998 had decided to place on Pine Ridge was passed down into the concrete of the school's foundation. That night, Mayor Higgins sat on the gym floor, his back against the wall and his eyes closed. He stayed in that position for roughly a minute. Tiago Dempsey stood gazing at the steel columns, given an expression the townspeople had never seen on him before. Wyatt Sullivan leaned his forehead against the closest column and remained there, silent, for a long stretch. Those on the opposite side of the gym, along with others who had observed the operation from a distance, started to move little by little. Because the work area was tight, the mayor had ordered that nobody approach while the process was underway. It was now evident that the noise of the wood yielding had come to an end. Adeline stood in the middle of the cleared workspace, her hand still holding the lever of the 4th jack. She listened to the structure's settled silence, the same silence she had often encountered in Chicago after finishing an inspection of a damaged building. It was also the silence she felt once she had confirmed the calculations were accurate. That kind of silence means the material is performing only as physics allows it to perform. The storm raged outside, but inside the building held firm. On the morning of the 10th of January 1998, dawn came to Pine Ridge, revealing a sky transformed from dark purple to a cold, transparent blue that looked freshly made. Only after a storm has consumed all available moisture does this sort of sky appear. The storm has departed and left behind an emptiness of absolute clarity. At some point in the preceding hours, the wind had diminished so slowly that no one could name the precise moment it stopped. Inside the school gym, the tapping against the windows had faded into silence. At some point, it simply occurred to someone that the wind had died down. The gymnasium doors, which opened outward, pushed against the snow that had built up on the threshold. The first people to emerge sank to their waists in the dense white layer covering everything. The valley, which the previous night had contained houses, barns, cars and streets, was now an almost flat plain. Only the tallest structures' remnants broke the surface in irregular shapes. Chimneys, building corners, and utility poles jutted out at about half their original height. The silence was complete, the kind that only happens when snow has muffled every sound, holding it deep below. In groups, 200 people came out of the school, their feet pushing into the snow. They wore the confused expression of someone still trying to process the scene. What they were seeing matched what had been there before they entered the shelter. From the school door, the houses had collapsed roofs. There were leaning walls, and buildings had caved inward under a weight they had never been designed to bear. Tiago Dempsey's workshop, easily seen from the main street, looked like it had a roof that had fallen completely onto the machinery inside. An entire side of the sawmill's storage shed was missing. On the road, heading up to Screaming Ridge, 3 houses had roofs that had bent into a V shape. Snow had filled up spaces that had been rooms hours before. Yet most of the 200 people leaving the school that morning did not look toward the valley streets first. A shared instinct seemed stronger than curiosity about the immediate destruction. Many looked up at the ridge, at Screaming Ridge, at the highest point of the rock formation that rose above the town to the east. Adeline Lawson's parabolic stone arch was exactly the same as they had left it. The last time they had seen it from the valley, the storm had not yet covered everything. The stones in the river were glistening, still wet beneath the morning sun. They had that special shine of wet stone hit by winter sunlight. There were no shifts or cracks visible on the arch. The snow kept sliding off its flanks. The snow settled exactly in the lines created by the deliberate 4-5 degree angle of the western face. It accumulated around the base on the ground, but not on the arch itself. Seen from any angle, it was the clearest possible image of what careful calculation can achieve. Tiago Dempsey stood in the snow for several minutes, looking at the ridge. He had put on the hard hat he always kept in his truck, out of habit or instinct, and then slowly removed it. He held it in his hand, and no one there could mistake the gesture for anything other than what it was. He didn't say a word during that time. When he finally spoke, he was looking at the ridge, not at any particular person. He said he needed to learn to build something like it. It was not a statement of surrender or a long compliment. It came out like an engineer who had just seen a solution he hadn't thought of and realizes it is better than his own. Adeline, just 2 meters away, looked at him for a moment and said she had the complete plans. Whenever the snow disappeared, he could stop by. Tiago nodded. And that was all. The reconstruction of Pine Ridge took more than 2 years. 27 structures had to be completely torn down. Another 43 required major structural work, often at a cost nearly equal to the original building's value. Emergency funds were provided by Flathead County. The state added a reconstruction program, and 8 groups came from Missoula and Great Falls with supplies and volunteers. It was a slow, costly, and draining effort for a small town. The 247 people who evacuated that night returned without a single loss to rebuild their homes. The only consolation available for many months was that nobody had died. Mayor Higgins submitted Adeline's arch documentation to the county building department. The documentation served as a basis for updating structural standards in high-altitude places susceptible to convergence events. It was not fast or easy, because building standards change slowly everywhere. But the records of what happened in January 1998 were clear. The argument for changing the area's roof load calculations needed almost no further justification. Just as they always had for Adeline, the figures made their own case. She remained in Pine Ridge, not because the town had all at once turned into the friendly and welcoming place it had never been for her. She stayed because the ridge and the arch were still precisely what they had always been. That spot now carried a different significance than it had on her arrival. Then it wasn't coming back merely because the arch was still upright, nor did the guilt lift just because the calculations had proven right. Yet carrying a debt is not the same as having made partial payment on it. Adeline grasped that distinction with precision, the sort of nuance engineers consider even if they seldom say it out loud. One morning, Donna Hargreaves, while pouring her coffee, asked whether she had considered returning to engineering work. Adeline said the idea had crossed her mind. Donna advised her to take all the time she required. "Yes, thank you," Adeline replied. The stone at Screaming Ridge stood in place, visible from anywhere in the valley when the weather was clear. It had the kind of permanence reserved for things constructed to survive the very causes that brought them into being. The arch had no need of an observer to remain what it was. Yet it was preferable when someone beheld it and recognized precisely what they saw. No.